They thought age and skin color made this couple powerless. They didn't know one phone call could silence an entire airline. Before I go on, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your country flag might just appear in the next story we share. The cabin was quiet at first. Passengers shuffled bags into overhead bins, folded jackets onto laps, and buckled themselves in for what should have been a routine flight. Yet in the middle of that ordinary moment sat an extraordinary couple. Their posture was straight, their hands folded neatly, their faces carrying the calm of people who had weathered storms larger than any delay or turbulence. They weren't wealthy celebrities demanding attention. They weren't loud. They weren't disruptive. They were simply two grandparents traveling to see their grandson graduate, something they had saved for, planned for, and looked forward to for months. Their tickets weren't discounted. They weren't favors. They had been purchased at full price, just like every other traveler in the first-class cabin. They belonged there. But belonging, as they were about to learn, is often questioned when the color of your skin speaks louder to others than the numbers on your boarding pass. The husband leaned slightly toward the window, looking out at the tarmac. The wife adjusted her scarf, a delicate shade of blue that rested gently around her shoulders. They didn't notice the way one flight attendant paused while glancing in their direction. They didn't hear the muttered comments from a white passenger a few rows behind, shifting uncomfortably as if sharing the cabin with them was somehow an offense. But others noticed. The tension was small at first, an exchanged look, a forced smile, a hesitation in offering water before takeoff. Subtle enough that most would ignore it. Yet subtlety can be the first stone laid in a path toward humiliation. For the couple, this wasn't new. They had lived through decades when doors closed, when signs told them where to sit, when respect had to be fought for. They carried that history in silence, not because they were ashamed, but because they had grown tired of explaining their right to exist in spaces they had paid to enter. Still, even with their quiet strength, they hoped this flight would be different. Just one uninterrupted journey, free of reminders that the world often measures worth in the wrong ways. The wife placed a hand gently on her husband's arm and smiled. "Soon we'll see him walk across that stage," she whispered. He nodded, holding on to the image of their grandson in a cap and gown, the pride of an entire family. For a brief moment, the cabin felt lighter. The promise of celebration outweighed the shadows of prejudice they had endured in their lives. But peace rarely lasts when entitlement decides it has a voice. From across the aisle, a man shifted forward in his seat. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set tight. His gaze locked onto them with the kind of authority that isn't earned but assumed. He pressed the call button above him. A ding echoed softly, drawing the attention of the flight crew. The same attendant who had hesitated earlier stepped closer. The man spoke, his voice cutting through the chatter, sharp enough to slice the cabin's fragile quiet. "Why are they sitting here? They need to move." His words were not whispered. They weren't cloaked in politeness. They landed heavy, drawing glances, raising eyebrows, and igniting a silence that spread row by row. The husband looked up, his eyes steady. The wife inhaled slowly, steadying herself. They both knew this moment carried weight beyond two leather seats in first class. And as the air grew still, as passengers shifted uneasily and the crew hovered between duty and prejudice, a question lingered in every corner of that cabin. Would they stay seated, or would the couple be forced to stand? The cabin seemed to shrink after that man's words. His complaint hadn't been quiet enough to dismiss as a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. His tone carried the assumption that the elderly couple didn't deserve the seats they occupied. The flight attendant leaned closer, her posture stiff, her smile thin. "Sir, what seems to be the issue?" "The issue," he said, his voice rising, "is that they're in the wrong seats. They should be moved." Heads turned. A teenager in the row ahead slid her earbuds out, listening. A mother hushed her child, but her eyes lingered on the scene. Even in first class, where people usually kept to themselves, silence fell like a curtain. The attendant shifted uneasily, glancing at the couple. Her words were wrapped in politeness, but the meaning was anything but. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable toward the back. We could arrange something for you." The husband looked up, calm but firm. "Our boarding passes are for these seats. We're not moving." The man snorted. "People pay good money for these spots. Don't tell me they did." The wife's fingers tightened slightly around her husband's hand. She didn't want a scene. They were elders, used to biting back words to avoid escalation. But this wasn't a casual insult whispered on a street corner. This was a public attempt to strip them of dignity. The flight attendant hesitated, caught between enforcing fairness and appeasing the passenger who was loud enough to disrupt the cabin. She chose wrong. "Sir, please lower your voice," she said. Then, turning toward the couple, "If you'd be willing to help us out, we could relocate you to other seats. It might make things easier for everyone." There it was. The suggestion that their comfort, their paid-for seats, their presence, was less important than keeping a prejudiced man happy. The husband spoke again, slower this time, measured. "We are not moving. These are our seats." The air thickened. The man's face reddened. He leaned forward, finger jabbing toward them. "You people always think rules don't apply. Get up and go where you belong." Gasps fluttered through the rows. A businessman 3 seats away lowered his newspaper, eyes narrowing. A young woman clutched her phone tighter, her thumb hovering near the record button. Everyone recognized what had just been said. The attendant's voice dropped, more urgent now. "Please, let's not escalate this further. Sir, calm down. And you too." She looked at the couple again, her tone softening but still patronizing. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder? For who?" The wife turned her head slowly, her gaze steady on the attendant. "We paid for these seats. We have every right to remain here. We will not be moving." A hush swept through the cabin once more. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried decades of patience, the weight of 1,000 similar moments endured in silence. The man slapped the armrest of his seat. "This is ridiculous. If they don't move, I'll have them removed." The attendant's radio crackled at her side. She whispered into it, her words too low to hear. But the glance she cast toward the cockpit made everything clear. She wasn't calling for assistance to calm the disruptive passenger. She was escalating, preparing to make the couple the problem. Passengers shifted uneasily. Some frowned, recognizing the injustice. Others looked away, unwilling to get involved. But no one could escape the truth. In that cabin, right then, a line had been drawn. The couple sat unmoving, hands still clasped. Their silence was not surrender, it was resistance. And while the crew debated whether to remove them, one thought pulsed through every row. How far would this humiliation go? The air in the cabin grew heavier with every second of silence. The man's words, "Go where you belong," still hung in the air, sharp as glass. And instead of correcting him, the flight attendant's expression hardened, as though the couple had brought the trouble upon themselves. She crouched slightly, her tone louder now so passengers nearby could hear. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to involve security." The husband straightened, his back against the seat. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence wasn't weakness, it was endurance. The wife's voice carried in his place. "We have done nothing wrong. We are sitting where we paid to sit." The man behind them barked a laugh. "Paid to sit? People like you don't sit in first class. You're slowing everyone down." Gasps rippled through the rows. Phones were raised now, screens glowing as passengers quietly started recording. What might have been brushed off as a misunderstanding was now undeniable. The prejudice was naked, and the entire cabin was watching. A woman 2 rows back muttered, "This is unbelievable." Another whispered to her husband, "Don't get involved, just let it play out." That was the problem. Too many were willing to watch, too few ready to speak. The attendant adjusted her jacket, as though straightening her authority. "Sir," she said to the husband, "I'm giving you one last chance. If you don't move voluntarily, we'll have security remove you." Remove. That was the word that stung deepest. Not relocate, not reseat, remove. As if they were intruders, not paying passengers. As if their presence defiled the neat image of first class. The husband's voice finally broke the silence. Steady, deep, unshaken. "We are not moving. Call whoever you must." The murmur among the passengers grew louder. One man shook his head, whispering, "They're not doing anything wrong." A college student clutched her phone tighter, whispering, "Keep recording. They can't erase this." But the loudest voice remained, the man who had started it all. He leaned over his armrest, jabbing a finger toward the wife. "You should be ashamed of yourselves, taking seats you don't deserve." The wife's eyes glistened, not with tears but with the exhaustion of a lifetime of being told exactly that. From schoolrooms to waiting rooms, from banks to flights like this one, always told her place was somewhere else. She inhaled, steadying herself, and said softly but clearly, "We are not ashamed. We are tired." The flight attendant stepped back, unclipped her radio, and spoke into it. The words weren't audible, but the meaning was clear when two uniformed staff began making their way down the aisle. The passengers' chatter swelled. Some gasped, some shook their heads, but no one moved to stop it. The humiliation wasn't just in the threat of removal. It was in the eyes of everyone watching. It was in the feeling of being on display, reduced to a spectacle. A young boy across the aisle asked his mother, "Why are they in trouble?" His mother pulled him close, whispering something he was too young to understand, but old enough to remember. The attendant stood near the couple now, not touching them, but close enough to remind them of power. The wife tightened her grip on her husband's hand. The cameras kept rolling. The man who had sparked it all smirked, certain he had won. And yet, amid the noise, amid the mounting humiliation, the couple didn't rise. Their refusal wasn't loud, wasn't violent. It was quiet defiance, a statement without a shout. Passengers leaned in, waiting for the next move, the next order. The cabin had become a stage, and all eyes were locked on two elders who had dared to claim what was rightfully theirs. Just as one of the attendants reached for the husband's arm, the wife slowly reached into her handbag. She pulled out a phone, held it firmly, and with steady fingers pressed a single contact. The call began to ring, and for the first time that flight, it wasn't the airline in control anymore. The cabin's tension was a knot pulled tight, ready to snap. One attendant's hand hovered near the husband's shoulder, another gestured toward the aisle, urging them to rise. But before either could act, the wife pressed her phone to her ear. The passengers closest leaned in. Some thought she was calling a relative to complain. Others assumed it was a futile attempt to capture evidence. But her calmness told a different story. Her voice, low but unwavering, carried enough for those nearby to hear. "It's happening again," she said. Those words alone made the attendants freeze. Again. This wasn't the first time. On the other end of the line, a man's voice sharpened. "Where are you?" "Gate 12, she answered. "First class, they're trying to remove us." The surrounding passengers stiffened. Something about the authority in her tone made them realize she wasn't just making a routine call. The husband sat straighter, his face unreadable, his hand never leaving hers. The attendant nearest her snapped, "Ma'am, you'll need to end that call. It's against safety regulations to use your phone at this stage." She didn't even glance up. "No," she said simply, continuing into the receiver. "Yes, right here. Everyone can see." The man's voice replied firmly, though passengers could only hear fragments. "Stay seated. Don't move. I'll handle it." The attendants exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time since this confrontation began, they weren't the ones in control. The wife ended the call and placed the phone back into her bag, her movements deliberate, slow, unafraid. The disruptive passenger who had sparked it all scoffed. "What good's a phone call gonna do? You're wasting everyone's time." But the cabin wasn't convinced anymore. Whispers rippled down the rows. One passenger muttered, "She knows someone." Another whispered, "Did you hear the way she said that? Like she expected this." Minutes ticked by, though they felt longer. The attendants stood back, uncertain now, their confidence shaken. Then it happened. The lead attendant's earpiece crackled, and her expression shifted instantly. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched. She whispered into her radio, listening intently, then glanced nervously toward the cockpit. Passengers picked up on the change. The woman across the aisle raised her phone higher, recording every flicker of hesitation. The businessman who had stayed silent lowered his newspaper entirely, watching with narrowed eyes. "Hold the boarding process," the lead attendant muttered, almost to herself. "Stand by." The cabin doors didn't close. Ground staff paused outside. Security officers who had been approaching suddenly stopped at the entrance, listening to instructions that had changed mid-step. The man demanding their removal frowned, his earlier smugness slipping into confusion. The husband finally spoke, his tone even but firm. "You should listen to that call you just received." The attendants didn't answer. They stood awkwardly, glancing toward the front, whispering among themselves. Something bigger than procedure had been set in motion, and it was rattling the very structure they thought protected them. The wife adjusted her scarf again, her composure unshaken. She leaned slightly toward her husband and said softly, "He knows." The truth was beginning to ripple across the plane. The person she had called wasn't just family. He was someone whose voice could cut through the walls of that aircraft faster than any captain or crew member. For the first time since the demand was made, the power in that cabin shifted. The couple wasn't standing alone anymore. Their dignity had found its defender. and the airline was about to feel the weight of it. The passengers sat in restless silence, phones poised, breaths held. They didn't know what was coming next, but the crew did, and the nervous glances in their eyes said enough. The order to remove the couple was no longer theirs to give. The cabin was no longer just tense, it was suspended, like time itself had been interrupted. Boarding had stopped, the jet bridge door stayed open, and the crew looked caught between orders and fear. Passengers glanced around in confusion. The man who had demanded the couple's removal kept shifting in his seat, his bravado leaking into irritation. "Why are we still sitting here? Get them out already," he barked. But this time no attendant rushed to obey. The lead attendant pressed her earpiece closer, listening intently to instructions being fed from the ground. Her eyes flicked toward the elderly couple, then away, as though staring too long might betray the unease that had overtaken her. The husband adjusted his glasses calmly. The wife rested her hands in her lap, her composure steady. Around them, first-class passengers sat motionless, some still recording, some whispering to each other. "Something's going on. Why aren't they moving? Did you see how her call changed everything?" A pair of uniformed security officers had reached the door earlier, but now they lingered at the threshold, listening to radios that buzzed with instructions no one else could hear. Whatever message had come down, it had been firm. "Hold position." The man who had started the ordeal slammed his hand against his armrest. "This is ridiculous. Do your jobs," he shouted at the attendants. But his outburst no longer carried the same weight. His arrogance was beginning to look smaller against the silence of the crew. Then, the captain emerged from the cockpit. The cabin, already taut with anticipation, grew quieter still. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. He pulled the lead attendant aside, murmured something, then glanced toward the couple. The passengers watched his every move. And then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a delay. Please remain seated as we coordinate with ground control." His voice was even, but the strain beneath it was unmistakable. Ground control. Everyone knew what that meant. This wasn't just a cabin dispute anymore. Something had reached higher levels, far beyond the aisle of this plane. The disruptive passenger scoffed, muttering, "Ground control? All this for them? You've got to be kidding me." He looked around for support, but the eyes that met his weren't approving. Even those who had stayed silent began to see him for what he was, the spark that had lit an inferno. The attendants still avoided the couple's gaze, but their deference had shifted. They weren't pressing for them to move anymore. They weren't issuing threats. They stood back, waiting for orders they could no longer control. The wife sat quietly, a faint steadiness in her posture. To an outsider, she might have seemed untouched, but she knew the weight of every stare in that cabin. Her call had been her shield, her refusal to be humiliated any longer. The husband leaned back, his voice low but steady, directed at no one in particular. "You see, when you stand long enough, people notice, even when they don't want to." A murmur spread again, softer this time. Not outrage, not gossip, but recognition. Some nodded faintly, others looked away, ashamed of their silence earlier. Minutes stretched. Every moment felt like a test of endurance. Then another ripple came through the crew's radios. The lead attendant stiffened, glanced at the captain, and nodded. She walked briskly toward the man who had started it all. Her tone was clipped, no longer deferential. "Sir, please lower your voice and remain seated. Further disruptions will not be tolerated." Gasps broke out. The balance had shifted. The man's mouth opened in protest, but no one rallied behind him now. He was alone. The couple hadn't moved an inch, yet the entire cabin had turned upside down. It was no longer about two elderly passengers holding on to their seats. It was about an airline realizing, too late, that one act of open prejudice had frozen its entire operation. And in that silence, everyone waited to see who truly held the power. The plane sat stalled at the gate. Engines quiet, cabin buzzing with the restless sound of whispers. The couple remained still in their seats, hands linked, eyes steady. They hadn't raised their voices, they hadn't moved, yet the entire airline operation had ground to a halt. The captain retreated to the cockpit, murmuring into his handset. The lead attendant lingered near the galley, waiting for instructions that weren't coming from her anymore. Every flicker of her eyes betrayed nerves she couldn't mask. And then the truth began to filter through the crew's radios. Passengers couldn't hear the words, but they saw the effect. Attendants stiffening, exchanging glances, one even muttering under her breath before quickly falling silent. Something far bigger than a seating dispute had reached them. The wife adjusted her scarf, as calm as when she had first dialed her phone. The husband leaned slightly toward her and asked softly, "Did you tell him everything?" "Enough," she replied. The man who had sparked the confrontation squirmed in his seat, suddenly less sure of himself. His earlier shouts now hung awkwardly in the air, unsupported. He turned to a passenger beside him, muttering, "They're dragging this out for no reason." But the passenger only shook his head and looked away. The tide had turned. Minutes later, the cabin door cracked open. A suited airline manager stepped inside, his badge gleaming, his face pale. He moved quickly toward the lead attendant, speaking in a low, urgent voice. She nodded stiffly, eyes darting toward the couple. The manager cleared his throat, then addressed the crew loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This situation is under review. No one is to touch or move these passengers. Do you understand?" The cabin went dead silent. The attendants nodded, their earlier authority collapsing in an instant. The disruptive man shot up in his seat. "What do you mean? Don't move them. They're the problem. I asked for this row. The manager cut him off. "Sir, you'll lower your voice or you'll be escorted off this aircraft." The man froze, his face reddening, his confidence shattering. For the first time, he was the one under threat of removal. The couple exchanged a glance. They didn't smile, didn't gloat. Dignity was their armor, and they wore it as naturally as breathing. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Who did she call? Why did the airline back down so fast? Something's going on. Then the truth slipped out. A ground agent speaking to the manager said it loud enough for a row of passengers to overhear. "Her son's with the Department of Transportation. Federal Board. He's already on the line with headquarters." The whispers became louder now, disbelief mixed with awe. "Federal Board? She called her son?" No wonder everything froze. The disruptive passenger slumped back in his seat, his earlier arrogance dissolving into silence. No one looked at him with sympathy anymore. His words, "Go where you belong," echoed differently now. They weren't commands, they were evidence of his own smallness. The attendants avoided the couple's eyes altogether now. They kept their distance, their clipped tones replaced with quiet deference. The power they had tried to wield had been stripped away with a single phone call. The wife sat with her hands folded neatly, her gaze forward. She didn't need to explain herself. The revelation spoke louder than any defense she could give. For decades, she and her husband had been forced to justify their presence, to prove they belonged. Today, it was the airline being forced to justify itself. And though the cabin had quieted, the truth now traveled faster than the plane ever could. Phones buzzed with texts being sent, videos uploaded, comments flying across social platforms. The story had already left the runway. The only question was how hard the landing would be, for the airline that chose racism over respect. The plane remained stalled, but the story was already airborne. What began as whispers in the cabin had turned into posts, photos, and shaky videos, rushing across timelines. Within minutes, strangers far from Gate 12 were sharing outrage, disbelief, and solidarity. The first clip to spread showed the moment the man sneered, "People like you don't sit in first class." Uploaded by a college student, still seated just a few rows away, it carried a caption, "They tried to kick an elderly black couple off the plane. Watch this." Thousands of views became tens of thousands in less than an hour. Another passenger live-streamed, narrating in real time. "They're just sitting there, calm, and everyone can see who's in the wrong, but the staff still sided against them. Now security won't even move." The chat filled with furious comments. "This is America in 2025? Sue them. We need names and badge numbers." The couple themselves remained silent, unaware in that moment of how many eyes were watching beyond the cabin walls. They were focused only on each other, holding steady, refusing to bow. But outside, the court of public opinion was already gathering. Inside airline headquarters, executives were scrambling. Screens lit up with alerts, hashtags, trending notifications. First class racism, respect your elders. Airline shame. What had started as a cabin dispute was now a reputational wildfire. The airline's first move was clumsy. A bland statement appeared on social media. "We are aware of a disruption on Flight 287 and are reviewing the situation. Safety of our passengers remains our top priority." It backfired instantly. Replies flooded in. "Stop calling racism a disruption. They weren't unsafe, your staff was. Deleting this won't save you." Screenshots spread faster than deletions. The coldness of the language only inflamed anger. On the plane, murmurs grew louder. Passengers whispered about the posts they had just seen, showing the couple's faces already trending online. A businessman who had stayed silent earlier leaned over to the young woman filming. "Send me that link. People need to know." For the first time, the bystanders who had shrunk into their seats began to shift toward support. The disruptive man, now red-faced and isolated, tried one last jab. "You people are overreacting. This won't last a day." But no one nodded this time. No one muttered in agreement. Even those who had looked away earlier turned from him with disgust. His authority had evaporated, leaving only the bitterness of his words behind. The couple didn't need to raise their voices. The world was raising them for them. Meanwhile, cable news crawlers picked up the story. "Elderly black couple targeted in first class," the headline read. Analysts speculated on air. This couldn't have come at a worse time for the airline. They're already facing scrutiny for customer treatment. Community leaders, civil rights advocates, and everyday travelers added their voices online. If this can happen to grandparents in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, what happens when no cameras are rolling? The question stung because everyone knew the answer. The airline's stock price dipped by mid-afternoon, small but noticeable. Investors called in, demanding explanations. Regulators reached out for incident reports. What was once the private humiliation of two elders was becoming a national case study on systemic bias at 30,000 feet. In the cabin, the wife leaned closer to her husband. Her voice was steady, but her eyes reflected years of fatigue. "They always think silence will protect them." He gave her hand a squeeze. "Not today." Phones buzzed again with breaking news alerts. The couple's son had released a statement, brief but cutting. "My parents will not be silenced. This will be addressed at the highest level." The passengers who had recorded the confrontation looked at each other knowingly. They hadn't just captured a viral video. They had documented the first sparks of an airline's reckoning. And all the while, the couple stayed seated. Proof that dignity could not be moved, no matter how hard racism tried. By the time the cabin settled into a tense stillness, the boardrooms downtown were in chaos. What the crew thought was a simple seating issue had now crossed into the domain of government oversight and corporate survival. The son's phone call had done more than freeze a flight. It had lit up an entire chain of command. As a senior figure on the Federal Transportation Board, he didn't just oversee regulations. He had authority to demand answers from every major airline operating in U.S. skies. His call had bypassed customer service hotlines and middle managers. It went straight to the top. At headquarters, the airline's legal team huddled with public relations executives. Screens replayed the clips flooding social media. Every replay of the man's sneer, "People like you don't sit in first class," was a nail in the coffin of their defense. One executive muttered, "This could tank the African route's expansion. We can't afford this right now." Another snapped back, "It's already out of our hands. He's got regulators breathing down our necks." Meanwhile, the Sun issued a formal notice. The Department of Transportation is requesting immediate documentation of Flight 287. Failure to comply will result in federal review. It was a direct warning, one that carried the weight of both authority and personal fury. On the plane, the attendants were visibly rattled. They whispered to each other in the galley, throwing nervous glances at the couple. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that even their posture seemed smaller. The disruptive passenger, once emboldened by their silence, now looked cornered. He muttered complaints under his breath, but no one cared. The spotlight had moved past him and onto the airline itself. The husband sat with quiet dignity, his gaze fixed forward. The wife adjusted her scarf again, her poise unbroken. They weren't celebrating their son's intervention, nor were they smug. Their stillness carried a message. They hadn't asked for special treatment. They had only asked for fairness. The airline had given them humiliation instead. In boardrooms, the debate raged. Should they settle quickly, apologize broadly, or attempt to downplay? A vice president suggested issuing vouchers and moving on. Another slammed a folder shut. "Are you out of your mind? This isn't about vouchers. This is about discrimination. Caught on camera, tied directly to a federal regulator's family. If we mishandle this, it won't just be bad press. It'll be regulatory hell." The CEO, pale and tense, leaned over the table. "Then, what's our move?" A silence followed. No one had an easy answer, because for once, money and branding couldn't disguise the truth. Back in the cabin, the captain made another announcement. We are experiencing a further delay while ground control finalizes clearance. Please remain in your seats. His words were flat, but passengers could hear what he didn't say. This flight was frozen until the higher-ups gave the green light. The man who had caused the uproar tried again, desperate to reclaim control. This is insane. They should be the ones leaving. But this time, the businessman who had been silent earlier turned and stared directly at him. No. You should be. The hush that followed was heavier than any outburst. It was solidarity forming, slow but certain. The wife looked at her husband, her eyes weary but resolute. Do you see? The truth is louder now. And indeed, the truth was echoing far beyond that cabin. Executives feared it. Investors braced for it. Regulators demanded it. The airline had spent decades shaping its image as welcoming, efficient, polished. But a single act of racism, captured on phones, amplified by voices, was tearing through that facade. What began with one arrogant demand in first class had reached the desks of the nation's most powerful decision-makers, and the cost was only beginning to surface. The boardrooms argued over damage control, the investors fretted over stock drops, and regulators fired off memos. But inside that cabin, none of it mattered to the two people at the center of it all. The husband sat with his shoulders straight, eyes fixed on the aisle ahead. His hand still rested gently over his wife's. He had been silent through most of the ordeal, but silence for him was not new. Silence had been a shield, honed over years of being told to wait your turn, to not cause trouble, to stay in your place. The wife stared out of the small window, seeing nothing of the runway outside. Her mind was elsewhere. Years earlier, when she was a young mother told she couldn't sit in a certain restaurant, when she was denied service at a department store, when a neighbor once asked her if she could please use the side entrance. Those wounds never healed. They simply layered one over another. And here they were again, decades later, facing the same script in a different setting. A flight attendant telling them to move. A passenger declaring they didn't belong. An entire cabin of witnesses watching them endure the weight of words too familiar. To the passengers recording on their phones, this was shocking. To the couple, it was exhausting. The humiliation wasn't just about 2 seats in first class. It was about being reduced, once more, to strangers' assumptions of worth. It was about hearing entitlement declare itself out loud while respect shrank into silence. It was about being put on display as if their very presence was a disruption. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her friend and whispered, "They look so calm, I'd be in tears." But calm was not ease. It was survival. They had learned that dignity was the only armor no one could strip away, no matter how loudly the world insisted they didn't belong. The husband's thoughts drifted to their grandson, the very reason they had booked this trip. He pictured the young man in his cap and gown, crossing the stage with the family's legacy stitched into his walk. What lesson would this flight teach him if he ever saw the footage? That even achievement, age, and respectability could be dismissed in a second? Or that standing firm, even quietly, could bend systems to accountability? The wife's voice finally broke the silence, quiet but carrying the weight of years. How many more times? Her husband looked at her, eyes soft. As long as they let this live in them, but today, they'll have to answer for it. Around them, passengers wrestled with their own guilt. Some regretted staying silent when the confrontation began. Some were ashamed it took a phone call to shift the tide. A young man whispered to his friend, "My grandmother went through this. I thought we were past it." But the truth was undeniable. Racism doesn't vanish with time. It adapts. It disguises itself in politeness until it no longer needs to. Today, it showed itself plainly. Right there in row 2, in front of the whole world. And while executives strategized and regulators drafted demands, the cost for the couple was something no boardroom could calculate. It was the sting of being reminded that their place could always be questioned, that respect could always be withdrawn. They weren't thinking about stock prices. They weren't thinking about hashtags. They were thinking about how much weight a lifetime carries when every victory, every earned right, can still be snatched away in public. The humiliation had already scarred them, but it would not silence them. And in their refusal to move, they had done something extraordinary. They had turned humiliation into exposure. Now the question was whether the world watching would see it for what it truly was. By the time the flight finally pushed back from the gate, the couple's names were already in thousands of mouths they had never met. What began as humiliation inside a cabin had become a rallying cry far beyond the walls of that aircraft. Messages poured across platforms. Stand strong, Grandma and Grandpa. You represent all of us who've been told we don't belong. We're with you. People who had never met them began to speak of them as family, addressing them with affection that showed how deeply their dignity resonated. Letters followed in the days after. Handwritten notes arrived at their home from strangers who had seen themselves reflected in their ordeal. A black nurse wrote, "I watched you refuse to move. It gave me courage to push back when a patient questioned if I was really their doctor." A young father said, "I thought of my parents when I saw you. Thank you for showing my kids that standing firm matters." Inside the cabin, the shift had already begun. Passengers who had sat in silence at the start now leaned toward them with quiet words. A woman across the aisle reached over and whispered, "I'm sorry for not speaking sooner. You shouldn't have had to go through that." The wife nodded, her lips pressed together in a faint smile, not out of joy, but in recognition of the effort. Apologies didn't erase what had happened, but they chipped away at the silence that had allowed it. When the plane finally reached its destination, news cameras waited at the gate. They hadn't asked for attention, but attention had found them. As they walked down the jet bridge, microphones were raised. Questions shouted, "How did it feel? What do you want the airline to say?" They didn't answer. Their silence outside the cabin wasn't avoidance. It was intention. They knew their son was already speaking for them at levels where their words would carry the weight of policy, not just sympathy. Their role had been to endure, to stay seated. And in that act, they had said enough. Back home, neighbors stopped by to offer meals and hugs. Church members stood with them during Sunday service, clapping as they entered. For once, the attention wasn't laced with pity. It was filled with respect. They weren't seen as victims, but as symbols of resilience. The wife, though, struggled with the emotional toll. Alone in the kitchen one evening, she whispered to her husband, "I didn't want to be anyone's symbol. I just wanted to get there, see him walk across the stage." He wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders. "And we will. But maybe God decided that the walk needed to be bigger than the stage." Their grandson called that night, voice filled with pride. "Grandma, Grandpa, you went viral. My whole campus is talking about you. Everyone's saying you're heroes." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "We're not heroes. We're just tired of moving for people who think we don't belong." But whether they wanted the title or not, the public had already decided. Civil rights groups reached out, community leaders called, social justice organizations amplified their story. Their stillness in row 2 had become a spark carried into homes, classrooms, and boardrooms alike. The airline, now fully on defense, issued a second statement, this time dripping with apology. "We extend our deepest regrets to the passengers involved and are committed to reviewing our policies to ensure respect and equality for all travelers." It was late, hollow, and transparent. But even empty apologies carry weight when paired with pressure. The couple didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their silence remained their most powerful statement. What mattered now wasn't what the airline said. It was what ordinary people had seen, and the way they were refusing to let it fade. The airline had spent years polishing its image. Glossy commercials of smiling crews, posters boasting about comfort and inclusivity, slogans promising respect in the skies. But no amount of marketing could erase the footage now flooding every corner of the internet. What happened in row 2 wasn't just a customer service failure. It was proof that racism had been allowed to live inside company culture, hidden until one passenger's entitlement exposed it in full. Regulators descended quickly. Federal investigators demanded logs, communications, training manuals, and staff records. "We need every detail of what occurred on Flight 287. One directive read. The Sun's influence had ensured there would be no quiet sweeping under the rug. This wasn't going away with vouchers or statements. Inside headquarters, panic gave way to fear. Executives faced shareholders in a tense call that stretched for hours. One investor asked bluntly, "How do we defend a company that sided against grandparents on video in the year 2025? Silence followed. There was no defense. Community leaders amplified the pressure. Civil rights groups threatened boycotts unless changes were made. Activists staged demonstrations at major airports, holding signs that read, "Dignity doesn't need a boarding pass." Travelers began canceling tickets, posting screenshots of refunds online. The airline's leadership scrambled to propose reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for flight crews. Clearer policies for handling passenger disputes. oversight committees involving external advocates. These were presented as proactive steps, but everyone knew they were forced measures, dragged into existence by outrage rather than moral conviction. The disruptive passenger who once felt emboldened to shout, "Go where you belong," was quietly banned from flying with the airline again. It wasn't announced publicly, but word leaked, fueling headlines. Airline bans passenger amid racism scandal. The company hoped it would redirect blame. Instead, it deepened the anger. People asked, why punish one man when the entire crew enforced his prejudice? On the ground, staff whispered nervously. Some admitted what passengers already knew, that discriminatory treatment wasn't new. "This just happened to get caught," one employee confessed anonymously. That admission spread like wildfire, confirming suspicions that this wasn't an isolated case. The couple themselves stayed silent. They didn't appear at press conferences, didn't sit for interviews, didn't chase headlines. Their son carried their words to the people who needed to hear them most. His statement to regulators was measured but sharp. "This incident reflects systemic disregard for Black travelers. It will not be solved with apologies. It must be solved with accountability." Behind closed doors, executives debated settlements. Numbers were whispered, legal agreements drafted, but the couple refused quick compensation. Their response was simple: change the system, not just our seats. The reckoning went deeper still. Airlines across the industry watched nervously, knowing this wasn't just about one company. Lawmakers began drafting proposals requiring independent monitors for discrimination complaints in air travel. Advocacy groups pushed for legislation that would give passengers stronger rights in cases of racial bias. The image of two elders sitting firm in their seats became the symbol of that push. It was replayed in hearings, cited in debates, and written about in editorials. Their dignity had become the foundation of reform. At headquarters, the CEO stared at the company's plunging stock chart and muttered, "All this from one flight." But it wasn't just one flight. It was decades of ignored complaints, brushed off concerns, and silent prejudice, finally captured on camera and amplified into the national conscience. The airline's reckoning was only beginning, and every step they took from here on out would be measured against the quiet strength of the two passengers they tried to remove. And while the boardroom scrambled, the couple packed for another trip. Not in fear, but in defiance. They had lived through enough humiliation to know one truth: you cannot erase dignity once it has been witnessed by the world. They asked them to move seats. Instead, they moved a nation. The couple had not set out to become a symbol. Their only plan had been simple: to fly, to arrive, and to see their grandson cross the stage with diploma in hand. But racism rarely respects simple plans. It forces ordinary people into extraordinary moments, and dignity becomes the only weapon left to wield. Their refusal to move had done what outrage alone could not. It had stripped the mask from a system that pretended to value fairness, exposing the arrogance that said certain people don't belong, even when they've paid for their place. It showed the world that prejudice doesn't whisper in shadows, it shouts in first-class cabins. The arrogance of discrimination was on full display that day. A passenger who believed money gave him authority over others. A crew who chose to appease him instead of uphold justice. An airline that initially dismissed the ordeal as a disruption. Together, they revealed how deep the roots of bias still run. But standing against that arrogance was something stronger: the quiet power of dignity. The couple didn't need to shout, they didn't throw insults or threats, they stayed seated, hands clasped, eyes forward. And in doing so, they became immovable. Their stillness forced an airline to freeze, forced executives to stumble, forced a nation to watch. When the news cycle churned and analysts debated, the couple kept their focus on what mattered most. Days later, dressed in their Sunday best, they walked into an auditorium filled with students and families. This time, there were no attendants hovering, no passengers sneering, only pride swelling in their hearts as they watched their grandson line up in his cap and gown. The wife dabbed her eyes with a tissue as his name was called. The husband's chest rose with quiet pride as the young man stepped across the stage. Cameras flashed, applause thundered, and for a moment, the pain of the flight seemed far away. They had made it. They were exactly where they belonged. Yet even in that moment of joy, the weight of what had happened lingered. Because while their grandson received his diploma, they knew there were countless others who would never have their resistance recorded, whose humiliation would go unseen, unacknowledged, unpunished. Their story had become public, Not because racism was rare, but because it had finally been captured in the right place at the right time. After the ceremony, their grandson ran into their arms, hugging them tightly. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. The irony wasn't lost on them, that the one milestone they had come to witness had been overshadowed by their own unplanned role in history. The wife kissed her grandson's cheek and whispered back, "No, baby, we're proud of you. Don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong." In the weeks that followed, reforms were announced, training programs rolled out, policy changes were drafted. Whether they would be enough was uncertain, but the couple knew one truth. Progress never begins with comfort, it begins with confrontation. And their confrontation had not been loud, had not been violent. It had been two elders refusing to move from seats they had earned. That quiet act now lived as a reminder that dignity cannot be purchased or revoked. A reminder that racism, no matter how bold or subtle, still poisons spaces that claim to be equal. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance echo the loudest. They asked them to move seats. Instead, they taught a lesson no airline, no passenger, no nation could ignore. They thought age made them weak, but wisdom and dignity carried more weight than power ever could. That flight, frozen on the tarmac, became more than an inconvenience. It became a mirror reflecting the arrogance of those who believe a boarding pass and a smirk can erase another person's worth. A mirror exposing an airline that chose comfort for one over justice for two. A mirror showing a nation that prejudice doesn't vanish with time. It hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment to declare itself. And yet, in that same mirror, the world saw something else. Two elders who refused to surrender their dignity. Two grandparents who decided that silence was no longer survival, but surrender. Two passengers who understood that staying seated was not about convenience, it was about belonging. The husband never raised his voice, the wife didn't shout. Together, they showed a strength that shook an industry. While a man screamed, while attendants floundered, while executives panicked, they sat still, immovable. That stillness carried more authority than any policy manual, more gravity than any public statement, because dignity is not loud. Dignity is not flashy. Dignity does not demand attention, it commands it. And once the world saw their quiet defiance, it could not look away. Their refusal to move exposed an old truth in a new way. Racism is not always cloaked in hate symbols or violent outbursts. Sometimes it lives in a request delivered with a fake smile. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back. Sometimes it lives in the entitlement of one passenger pointing a finger and saying, "People like you don't belong here." It is quieter, but no less cruel. And it is that quiet cruelty that makes resistance all the more necessary. The couple knew this better than anyone. They had lived long enough to see laws change, schools integrate, and signs torn down. Yet here they were, in their 70s, still being told to move, still being asked to make themselves smaller, still being asked to disappear. But instead of disappearing, they became unshakable. And that is why their story matters, not because they had power in their pockets, not because they had influence through their son, but because they had dignity in their souls. And when dignity collides with discrimination, only one can last. The arrogance of that passenger, the cowardice of that crew, the scrambling of those executives. None of it could outweigh the steady truth of two elders holding their ground. And now the question turns to us. How many times have we witnessed someone treated unfairly in public? How many times have we seen someone talked down to in a store, targeted in a classroom, singled out on a street corner, or shamed in a waiting room? And in those moments, did we speak? Or did we stay silent, telling ourselves it wasn't our fight? It's easy to watch injustice and assume someone else will handle it. It's harder to stand, to speak, to risk being alone in defense of what's right. But that couple showed us that even without shouting, even without force, resistance can be as simple as saying, "We will not move." Would you speak up, even if it meant standing alone? Would you be the person who pulls out a phone to record, who challenges the unjust request, who says clearly, "No, they belong here just as much as anyone"? Because silence protects prejudice. And silence was what those flight attendants were counting on. That no one would resist, that no one would question, that no one would remember. But people did resist, they did question. And because of that, the whole world remembered. The couple's act wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about bringing an airline to its knees. It was about telling the world, with their very bodies, that dignity does not move when arrogance demands it. And that message didn't just reach passengers on that plane. It reached investors, regulators, lawmakers, and communities across the nation. More importantly, it reached us, watching, listening, reflecting. So ask yourself now, the next time you see injustice, will you be a bystander, or will you be the one who refuses to let humiliation go unchallenged? Their story gives us no easy answers, but it leaves us with a challenge. They asked them to move seats. Instead, they moved a nation. And now it is our turn. If you felt the weight of this story, if you've seen yourself or someone you love in that couple's stillness, I invite you to carry it forward. Don't let it fade as another video, another headline, another passing outrage. Let it shape the way you respond when the test comes to you. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly in public? Did you speak, or did you stay silent? Would you speak up, even if it meant standing alone? Because sometimes change doesn't come from boardrooms or courtrooms. Sometimes it begins with one voice in a crowd saying, "That's not right." And sometimes it begins with two grandparents refusing to move from seats they had already earned. This is not just their story. It's ours now. If you believe in justice, in dignity, in the power of standing firm, even when the world tells you to shrink, then join us. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ for more powerful stories of justice, dignity, and redemption. Drop your country flag in the comments. We want to know where you're watching from, and we want to stand with you. Because together, we can make sure their silence is never mistaken for weakness, and their dignity is never forgotten. They thought age made them weak. But wisdom and dignity carried more weight than power ever could.